On that note, we will move to our second panel today, which is on moving a few centuries back on ancient art. We have a wonderful panel lined up. Let me call the panelists on stage. First up, we have Parul Pandya Dhar. Parul Pandya Dhar is a professor of art history in the Department of History at the University of Delhi. She's associated with the National Museum, Delhi University. She has received grants and fellowships from the German Humboldt Foundation. She's an author, artist, and columnist. Her work engages with ancient and medieval Indian and Southeast Asian visual and performing arts. Her recent book is Connected Histories of India and Southeast Asia. The forthcoming monograph examines artistic processes in the early Deccan. We have Naman Ahuja. Naman, can you come on stage? Naman Ahuja is Professor of Art History at Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, and the General Editor of Marg. His research and curatorial work focus on ancient Indian art, including terracottas and small everyday objects, examining the foundations of Indian visual aesthetics. His publications and exhibitions explore iconography, transcultural exchanges in antiquity, and the historiography of the arts and crafts movement. His writings have been translated into several Indian and international languages, including Hindi, Marathi, French, Spanish, and Dutch. To help us navigate this conversation, may I call Pushkar Sohoni. Pushkar is a faculty member of IISER Pune with research interests in architecture, historic preservation, history of architecture and art, numismatics, and Indo-Persian studies. He has written several books on these themes. May I invite Pushkar to present the stalls to our speakers. So we're going to learn about sculpting the past, ancient art of India. And over to you, Pushkar.
Earlier, many kinds of histories were invoked. Political histories, diplomatic histories, industrial history of science, and so on. And the history of art has been conspicuously absent in the History Literature Festival for a long time now. And I'm glad that we get a chance to improve upon that. Today, we've decided to have a format which is slightly unusual. And the reason is, as art historians, most of our presentations tend to be visual. And we've decided to start with having 8 to 10 minute presentations by all of us, after which we'll have a conversation amongst ourselves for half an hour and then open it up for questions from everyone else. So without taking up much time, why don't I invite Parul to get started.
So good afternoon, friends, and it's an absolute delight to be here talking about what the three of us have made our careers with and what we really love doing, even outside our career time. We're going to be talking about different types of connections through the prism of visual and material cultures, crossing the boundaries of India sometimes and sometimes trans-regionally within different parts of India. Now, before Pushkar tells me, Parul, your time starts now, I'm just keeping tabs so that I don't take more than my designated 10 minutes, and we have time for conversation. Now, everybody likes a good story. So let me begin with a story that goes back so long ago that we can quite confidently say long, long time ago or once upon a time. Once upon a time, there were two brothers, Purna and Bhuvila. They were born to a very noble man living somewhere near the western coast of what is today Nalasopara or Sopara. Their mother was a slave woman, and therefore they were disinherited from their father's status and wealth. But the brothers were very, very clever and they were full of initiative, and they decided to embark upon several sea voyages. They became merchants of the sea, they earned a lot of wealth, and over 6 voyages, towards the end of the 6th voyage, Purna met some Buddhist monks and Buddhists in general from the region of Sarnath, and he was heavily influenced by that. Bhuvila went on a 7th voyage where he was shipwrecked and met several dangers of the sea, and it is because of Purna's wisdom gained through his association with Buddhism that he could recall the Buddha's teachings and save his brother from shipwreck. Now, this is not something I made up to break the monotony, but this is actually recorded in a text, a Buddhist text, that belongs to about 2,000 years ago, the turn of the first millennium AD, and it is recorded in the Divyavadana. It is the second Avadana, the Purna Avadana of the Divyavadana. Now, what does this tell us? It tells us many, many things. It tells us about trade across the Indian Ocean. It tells us about merchant sailors. It tells us about the great connection between trade and the spread of Buddhism to different parts across Asia. And it also tells us about the history of emotions and mentalities, about how seafarers faced so many dangers and had to be, they were recalling or remembering certain beliefs within them, evoking certain beliefs within them to see them through. Sometimes they wore amulets, sometimes they remembered the Bodhisattva, sometimes they wore certain totems or carried certain things with them to save them from various dangers that the sea brought when they traveled across. This is exactly what you see on the screen right now. And you have on the left side a very beautiful detail from a painting from Ajanta. And there you see the ship with 3 masts, the beautifully shown waters of the ocean, and there, the cargo. And this triple-masted ship is a 5th century AD painting from Ajanta. There's another site across the eastern Indian Ocean in the Java Sea, Borobudur, a world-famous Buddhist stupa complex where you have the most beautiful renditions of ships of many different types, and both these ships also have something else in common. Both of them have been emulated in modern times, and of course, giving leeway for artistic imagination, both these ships have been reconstructed, and from Indonesia, a voyage to Madagascar, and from the Gujarat coast, a voyage to Oman has been conducted in modern times. There's yet another journey across the ocean taken by Rabindranath Tagore in the modern times to understand what was going on in Asia of the first millennium and what what kind of connections, why were we connecting? Today's world, www. And you are in the US today and in Australia tomorrow. But what motivated people to take such arduous journeys is something that, as our previous panelist was telling us, during the eve of India's independence, this glory that was India was evoked in the form of the Greater India Society and its researches to place India at the center of the map on the eve of the Indian independence. But Tagore, although part of that Greater India Society, was extremely conscious, and this is from the eve of his departure on the voyage, that he says, "When I get to Java, let me rid my mind of pride and be humble on seeing how the underlying essence of truth works." Now, it's been a long time. We are within a revised historiography of how India and Southeast Asia connected. We no longer talk of the golden land that India has always been. Actually, for a fact, golden land or Suvarna Bhumi or, is actually in Southeast Asia. And there's a lot of debate about where in Southeast Asia Suvarna Bhumi exists. So you see how text and image relate with each other. You also see how the image holds relevance in the present times, and you also see what the image adds to what the text does not say, and vice versa. Let me take the next one. Now, this is what would qualify, perhaps, if you consider that a story, although with proper sources, what would qualify as historical evidence in the sense of a message that a mariner, a Mahanavika, a sea captain, leaves behind off the coast of Malaysia, where he offers gratitude on the completion of a successful voyage, Siddhayatra. He belongs to a place called Rattamritika, that is essentially dark soil, and that has been thought of by some scholars to be Bengal, but we cannot be sure. The stupa type that you see here actually resembles Western Deccan stupas. And he offers gratitude along the coast of Malaysia, the Western Thai Malay borders, somewhere here, near the Sungai Mas River, and where a lot of remains have been found, Buddhist as well as Hindu. And as you move along the time period, Arabic glass, Persian pottery, Chinese porcelain, and of course, Indic material culture. Now, how do we begin to analyze what this, how do we begin to interpret, say, two Vishnus that have been found in close proximity to each other in the region? One that looks very much late Pallava, early Chola, and is gigantic, has a very strong resemblance with South India, and the other one, also found in the same region, that looks completely Cambodian and local. Now, if you begin to analyze what the image tells you, you realize that influences are not unidirectional. That Buddhagupta stele that I just showed you is actually from Malaysia and is now in the Indian Museum, Calcutta. This Vishnu, the influence is coming from Cambodia to the peninsular coast of Malaysia. So that you have a very circuitous route of interaction, that it is not everything is proceeding from India every time. That is something that a text is not telling you, but the images are very, very clearly telling you. Let me move quickly over the next few slides. I spoke about how sailors faced a lot of dangers. that was one of the reasons, I'm not saying the only reason, why the worship of the Bodhisattva of compassion, Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, became so popular. It became a cult across Southeast Asia because this particular image that you see here is from Cave 7, Aurangabad. You also have images from Kanheri and Ajanta. And surrounding this Bodhisattva of compassion are 8 fears faced by people that the Ashta Mahabhaya Avalokiteshvara is capable of removing if you worship him. So these beliefs went along with trade to far off places. And here you have, in a detail, the ship, double-masted ship, with Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara rescuing the sailors. I come to the next one. What do you read from an icon like this? It has the body and the backside pedestal as well as the base Pitika, just like a South Indian sculpture. But you look at its face and hands, which have been changed in more recent times. And if you look at the inscriptions of the period along with this image, you know that it has a history of constant vandalizing, remaking, gilding, throwing into the ocean, capturing. It was potent as a symbol of prosperity of the Cham kingdom of southern Vietnam. And it transformed from being Bhagavati Kauthareshwari or Uma to becoming the Lady Po Ina Nagar of the Cham people, and again carried forward by the Vietnamese who took over, changing the meaning of the icon and worshipping her to this date, where Bhagavati Uma is now Lady Po Ina Nagar of Vietnam. Quickly to the next one. Yeah. Ideas travel sometimes, creating very different images. So ideas can go as texts, ideas can go as oral traditions, just like the idea of Meru traveled to Cambodia and created the visualities of Angkor Wat, of which you have no similarity in India. On top, the whole cosmogonical idea of the Meru is adopted as an imperial propaganda statement of the Khmer ruler Suryavarman II, who turns the galleries of Angkor Wat into a historical procession of his victory. So this is how localization and change happens. India is not transplanted there, and that is not Greater India. Sometimes visual correspondences are closer because of voyaging objects, like these miniature replicas of the Bodh Gaya temples that travel and have created very close congruences of Bodh Gaya temples all across Southeast Asia. And when it comes to narratives, we looked at architecture, we looked at artifacts, we looked at icons, we looked at the transference of an idea into an image, and the visual congruence when it is image to image. What happens with narratives like epics and Jataka stories? They completely change. They take on tones that are absolutely different, and that lies at the heart of why epics like the Ramayana have survived across Asia for such a long time. So let me, do I have 2 minutes? Yeah? So for example, in Java, what happens is the Ramayana is written like a kakavin in their style, and it does not follow the Valmiki Ramayana. It follows the Bhatti Kavya, or the Ravana Vadha, written by Bhatti in the 7th century. what do they do? How do they change it, you know, while some parts are very direct translations, the whole Ramayana in the Javanese tradition becomes more strongly a text in ethics and governance. And you have episodes like Rama telling Vibhishana about the Ashtabratas, the 8 virtues that are required by the king, which plays a very important part later in Islamic courts of the 14th century in Java. But there's an even more interesting aspect, and this is the last idea that I would like to plant before I finish. What happens when the epic is performed? How does it change in the moment? So you have, you know, in the Islamic tradition of the Ramayanas all across Southeast Asia, they're called hikayats. So you have Hikayat Shri Rama in Malaysia, and you have Hikayat Maharajavana. So Hikayat Shri Rama is Ramayan. Hikayat Maharajavana is Ravanayan. It is the story of Ravan. And the gods change. There is a pruning of the pantheon. There's an addition of gurus. And there is a great concern of different kinds of ethics, of legal issues, of governance that becomes more important. But here, there's a transformation in the sense that Brahma is in the Vayangkulit Kelantan or puppet show of Malaysia. Brahma resides in the heavens, Kayangan, and there is an imminent threat from the neighboring kingdom, and the name of the king is Dati Kuacha. Brahma is called Raja Barma. Now, Chitrabaha, who is Raja Barma or Brahma's son, kills the demon ogre king, Dati Kuacha, but he marries his widow, Rakshagandhi. So Brahma's son marries a demon's wife, who is also the daughter of a demon. Like Kaikasi is the mother of Ravana, but it's all changed here. And their son is Ravan. Now Ravan is errant, and he, because of several instances of misconduct and misbehavior, Ravan is banished by who? His grandfather, Raja Brahma. He is banished where? He is dropped from Kayangan heaven to Lanka. Now he conducts penance. Now again we are back to our Ramayana. We're losing it and we're coming back. It's changing. It's while being performed. Now he comes to Lanka, he performs penance. He meets, by the way, the prophet Adam, who Allah had sent to Lanka. And on Adam's request, and Allah says that Ravana has performed enough penance and he should now be forgiven. Adam then conveys that to Ravan, who agrees to give 1/4 of the kingdom to Adam's and children and grandchildren, and to live in the other 3 parts. Now, this is how the epic is changing while it is being performed as a puppet show. I leave that to you about how the visual, the material, and the performative is a very integral part of the histories of connected Asia in the first millennium. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the invitation to be here. I'm Naman Ahuja. I'm an art historian, and I look at objects of art in order to be able to reconstruct history. History of different kinds. A history of what art can do for us. It can communicate aesthetics. It can communicate a change in your way of looking at the world. It can give you something poetic. And what one civilization or period sense of poetry might be quite at variance with somebody else's. What you may derive a great sense of horror from might not be what your grandparents thought was perfectly horrifying, but you each need a kick of something that is going to instill and inspire a touch of something horrifying or something romantic or something that is erotic. And each will seek it through certain social determinants that happen in their time, that are a source for feeling that through a work of art. And their singers and their performers and their artists will strive, will be trained in order to be able to ensnare the audiences of their own times in certain ways. So what are those ways that we as art historians can study to be able to understand how these artists were being trained to captivate and capture their respective audiences in their times? And what does that tell me as a historian of a kind of a social history of that period? Now, one can do this with a wide array of artwork. An artwork then has to be contextualized and how it is aesthetically communicating religious values, folkloric ideas, as we just heard, or is it actually telling us something about transculturalism and transregionalism, which is something that I happen to spend a lot of time on in a lot of my work. And I thought I'd race you through some pieces of writing. So I did a piece, it was a piece of research that was funded by the Getty Foundation many years ago, and it was called Beyond Boundaries, and it was looking at the idea of an empire, the greatest of all ancient empires, the Roman Empire, but what happens to provinces and colonized people during a period of empire. Now, I know, I'm sorry I'm getting theoretical over here a little bit, but for those of you who come from the discipline of history, we are all very familiar with the concept of being colonized and being post-colonial, right? And what does it mean to be post-colonial? So an interesting question was, what happened during the Roman Empire to Ptolemaic Egypt? What happened to Parthia? What happened to Greece itself? Greece, which was once the land of a great empire, had now become colonized by Rome. Their imperial language had been taken away on their public monuments. They had to start using Latin. They weren't allowed to use Greek anymore. And Cleopatra, who was by now with Julius Caesar, declares her empire as one which could give domicile to Greek people, not citizenship, but domicile. And the Parthians in Iran call themselves Philhellenic, meaning friends of the Greek. Now, it is in this context, at about the same time in the 2nd century, that a rather remarkable, is there a pointer? I saw you had a pointer. On this itself. Oh, cool. Okay, got it. So it was at this time, somewhere near Peshawar, at Takht-e-Bahi, Yusufzai province, that at the entrance to a Buddhist monastery, they positioned a statue of a goddess called Hariti. And this particular Hariti is dressed as if she is either Aphrodite or Tike or maybe Isis, the Egyptian goddess. I'd seen it, used to work at the British Museum a long time ago as a curator, and I used to see it on the corridor in the gallery every day. Never thought anything of it till one day, the little kids around Hariti were not nameless to me anymore. I'd been studying art history, and I'd been learning about iconographic systems of communication, and suddenly one day I recognized that the kid over here is actually has 3 ponytails, and 3 ponytails and a little bird sitting on his wrist, and the 3 ponytails in ancient Indian art is a dead giveaway for Skanda Kartikeya. And if it is Kartikeya, then I said, really, is she Hariti? Because the mother of Kartikeya would be Uma, would be Parvati. And then I looked on exactly the opposite side, and there was another baby on the other side, and he had an Egyptian mohawk, right in the center, and shaven sides, and he had a finger to his lips. And that is the precise iconography for the child of Isis called Harpocrates. And Harpocrates had become the major deity, the export deity of the Roman Empire. And we find little statues of Harpocrates all the way from Hadrian's Wall in Northumbria, all the way through to Mathura, right? You get images of Harpocrates. And so this was the great export child god of the 2nd century AD. And of course in Peshawar too, he's there. And I said, oh, well, if that's Harpocrates, then maybe the mother figure is no longer Parvati, maybe she's Isis. And then I said, this is getting very confusing. Are they playing with me deliberately? Is this a pastiche? Is this a fake sculpture? And I looked into the records of the sculpture, and it turned out that it's been in the British Museum for 150 years. And it was one of the first sculptures to ever be noted and come into the museum's collection. And we began to study it further, and one by one, I began to decode what each of the different groups of children were. And there was somebody Greek, the Dioscuri, which later become what we call the constellation Gemini in Latin. And then there was a temple boy who is Phoenician, which is exactly the kind of baby boy that would be sacrificed at the shrine of Eshmun in Lebanon and in Cyprus. And it's what we call the Phoenician temple boy. And then there were two that I was not very sure about, but I think they might probably be Zoroastrian, but even if they're not, let's not get into the details of this. That's a very complex thing to talk about. But as one was looking at this entire conglomerate of different children from different iconographic systems, the interesting thing was that obviously the people of Peshawar in the 2nd century had amongst them all these different communities that were seeking representation at a public monument. And the Buddhist monastery was clearly saying that you are all children who belong to the Buddhist goddess Hariti, and you can all come, all you Zoroastrians and you Buddhists and you Hindus and you Egyptian Phoenicians and so on, can all Ptolemaic figures can all come to this particular site. And so it seemed almost sort of propagandist in nature with all these studies on migration and transculturalism. And that began to pose certain questions that, you know, when we study multiculturalism and so on, one's got to ask certain questions. Well, what of this multiculturalism? So what? So people were migrating. Yes, we've got 2 legs. We move. That's what we do as a species. So what of it? Has it engendered any great sympathy for the other? It appears not to. So what of all this migration and cosmopolitanism and all the rest of it? I can keep talking to a small group of people here and a small group of people somewhere else. But what of this trans-regionalism? Where does it all lead? And why is it that we as historians of ancient culture, as art historians particularly, are very keen to spot, oh, that figure is of a Kushan king and he is wearing a costume of Central Asia, and this Gandharan Lakshmi is wearing a crown which happens to be Roman, and she's carrying these. But so what? Did that mean that the people of ancient India were far more accommodating than you and I are? Does that mean that the people of ancient India were far more accepting of others in their midst and didn't think of others as barbarians or didn't think of others as being outcasts and were perfectly happy for their children to marry and intermarry between cultures? Certainly not, because we come from the most endogamous society on earth, right? And how then do we make sense of all of this? How do we, as historians and art historians, choose to present this material? Were the anxieties about multiculturalism any less in antiquity than they are today? And if they were not, then how do we look at this public statue? Was this public statue created at the monastery to make these communities feel more settled in Peshawar because they were feeling like outcasts? Was this performing some kind of a public role? How do we position that, the role of that public statue? So these questions began to work on the social history of these things. When these diasporic Greeks were busy moving out of their colonized condition in Greece itself and moving to Gandhar and moving to Peshawar, they're living there as refugees. And they're living there where the terms of assimilation, there is a dominant culture which happens to be either Brahmanical or Buddhist that is stipulating that at the Buddhist monastery we accept you as children of Hariti. It's not that we are being accepted as the children of Isis or the children of Aphrodite, where the Buddhists and the locals are converting. There's a terms of assimilation that are being put forward by the dominant culture, which in India happens to be, in South Asia at that time, happens to be either Buddhist or Brahmanical. And it is through their texts, through their caste regulations, that you can actually see what the terms of assimilation are. And so we need to use art history to be able to ballast what we can also sometimes see in the historical record. And the historical record can sometimes be full of a subtext of conflict if we only care to read it. So one site that I worked on along with Parul over here in Telangana was Phanigiri. And Phanigiri is famous, as you will all know, for its wonderful inscription by Rudra Purusha Datta. And I'll read that inscription out to you in a second, but it's also got some other rather remarkable features in the sculpture, some extraordinary Mithun sculptures of couples together and so on. And I shan't get into the wonderfully charming and poetic and evocative ways in which romance is being communicated at a monument of death as a stupa, which is quite an interesting psychological combination in itself. But what I wanted to talk about, carrying on with the politics of assimilation, is this remarkable inscription, which is bilingual, and it says, "The chief physician of King Rudra Purusha Datta of well-known blazing fame carried out this erection of a dharma chakra. The banner of pride, the dhwaj, the pataka, of the one with the makar." So who has the makara dhwaj? Kamadev, right? Was not felled by the one with the bull banner. Who has the dhwaj of the bull? Shiva. So Kamadev, who was not killed by Shiva, has been killed by this dharma chakra. Passions, human passion, desire has been conquered by Buddhism. The next, the demon of hatred that was not killed by the mighty killer of Kans, i.e. Krishna, the killer of Madhu and Kaitab, Vishnu, that one has been killed by the passion, by the killer of passion by means of this excellent dharma chakra. So you've got an inscription that says, oh, okay, even Vishnu has been conquered by Buddha, right? So there is an environment in which, in the 3rd, 4th centuries, the stupa of Phanigiri is being built, and it is communicating a lot to us. And it's in that context that we need to position the artwork, which is performing a public service, which is echoing these sentiments. And what is the milieu in which we study an artwork? How do we contextualize it? So we, as art historians, tend to not just look at the poetry that comes with a particular civilization, but also the meter and the rhyme and the rhythm and the performance history that accompanies that material, as Parul was just saying, when we look at puppetry alongside mythology to be able to see how the visual and the performative work together within a context of the economic trade or the religious history of that time. The third book that I should quickly bring to your notice, which is called the Chandayan, was a study that I began about some 25 odd years ago originally, which was to look at 4 medieval manuscripts, late Sultanate period manuscripts, which have survived, which have this fantastically racy romance that comes from eastern UP, Chhattisgarh area, Allahabad, that zone. and it is in Avdhi, and it has the romance of Lorak and Chanda. And Lorak and Chanda are both married, they leave their respective spouses, and they run away with each other, causing great consternation in society. Their parents don't know what to do about it. Their estranged partners don't know how quite to deal with the situation. It becomes a very real, ribald human tale, and yet it is harnessed by the Sufis from the late Tughlaq period to be able to communicate a Sufi message of ishq. The protagonist, Lorak, is one of these goons for hire. He is a soldier, he's a mercenary by profession. And that tells us something a lot about the kind of socioeconomics of the class society in which this epic is operating. And yet the Sultanate kings seem to get every sultan, whether it is Ahmednagar or whether it is Palam in Delhi or whether it is Mandu or whether it is Jaunpur, seems to have a copy of the Chandayan. So it's quite remarkable to see this popular tale. It's a Sufi story, but it relies on a certain visual language of communication. And that visual language of communication is coming out of classical Indian poetics. But the classical Indian poetics are now in a folk vernacular of Avadhi. It's not in high Sanskrit. And there you have the Nayika pulling out the thorn from her foot and the one who will be communicating through a whole language of gesture and posture. And it's only when you know a visual language of gesture and posture that you can actually start reading the paintings, which you can't do unless you know what the paintings are communicating. And so it goes back to an older layer of the kind of Nayikas you would see on the walls of a temple like Khajuraho, which seem to have been completely absorbed now in the Tughlaq and then in the Lodi period in the manuscript culture that is floating around in the early sultanates. And so when you're talking about the Indianization of the Sultanate in the Tughlaq period, this really becomes a key text in order to be able to understand how that was happening in the cultural world of that period, because you can actually look at it all. And so as art historians, what do? We disaggregate our paintings and our artwork. We tear their iconography into little elements. We take a manuscript and its painting and we look at every little element of it in separation, and then we see how it is communicating. What is the history of that motif and the history of the way it is rendered. We try and tell the history of that and contextualize that, and that's what one did with the Chandayan over here. One looked at every little element separately. And then the poem comes alive. The language comes alive, you know. Just because I'm here in Hyderabad and you make the most delicious food in this city, I thought that I would show you what the Chandayan has to say about food in terms of material culture and material history. And so there in the far corner, you have a painting with the women making Rumali rotis, which are not being made with a balan, right? They're being spun on their hands. And you see an Indian, these paintings are all about 1420 or so roughly. And so now you have visual evidence for the way in which rotis are being made in 1420. There was a feast that the Rai has. He's not the king, he's not the sultan, he's the Rai. He's a Rai of a small town. And the Rai of the small town is throwing a feast, and there are 4 paintings. One painting about the kind of big game. One painting about the big game that he has collected and skinned, and the deer that have, and all the big game that he's collected. One of the fowl and all the birds he has collected. One of the vegetables, and one of the different kinds of rice. And then there's another one of all the different kinds of dal. And then there's another one of all the different trees that are being used to be able to make the plates and the katoris and the cups and the glasses for all the guests, where all the dining equipment has to be made. This is all being done in preparation for a feast. We have specific verses about the kind of market and the kind of things that the traders carried from location to location. So coming back to this idea of migration and movement and what people carried from place to place, the paintings can enliven, the artwork and the sculpture enliven what historians can do, providing a different kind of visual evidence, but a visual evidence that is reliant on a reading of aesthetics as much as it is on a reading of material culture. I'll leave you with that. Thank you.
I think I'll pick up on that right away. I actually will talk about something else in art history, which is the study of buildings more than sculpture or performance or painting, though I will mention painting briefly. Now, the problem with history teaching in India is that it's been made devoid of any kind of color, and I mean a metaphorical color. Everybody is talking really of accounts, everybody is talking of revenues, treaties, political histories, wars, and so on. But a lot of the history that we receive comes in the form of materials, material culture, architecture, art, and just having these kinds of materials to study tells a very different narrative, and that will be one of the thrusts of what I talk about. As a child, I grew up looking at a lot of temples that looked like this, and conventionally you would not associate these forms with temple building, minarets, domes, Mughal chhatris, and so on, squinch arches, which in a art history class you will be told are all Islamic. But what is prescribed is very different from how people live their lives. And art history has the potential to provide a different kind of narrative than that given by texts, because texts tend to be prescriptive a lot of times. Even the descriptions try to conform to some kind of normative behavior, whereas what people do in their lives is far from normative, and it's a lot more syncretic. And so the next thing I encountered was what looked like tombs, but almost all of them are samadhis except for the one in the middle center, bottom center. That is actually a tomb which is well celebrated as one of the earliest known tombs of this form, a square chamber with a dome on top of it to commemorate a dead person. And it was built in the 10th century in Bukhara. And essentially till the 17th, 18th, 19th century, all across the Deccan, nobility who are not Muslim are building for themselves memorials that look like this. And so what are people doing? Why are they emulating this kind of built form when there is no religious requirement to do this? There is nothing that is getting buried. There is no tradition of memorializing in this way. And this also tells you about the aspirations of communities that do this. They are essentially following a language of power, a physical language of power. So if your ruler is going to carry out certain kinds of actions, patronize certain kinds of buildings, and also build certain kinds of monuments, these are seen as effects of power, and everybody will try to emulate them in some way. So again, I mean, whatever the leader of a powerful kingdom might do will be copied, just like people like to do things that their bosses or their professors might do otherwise. I wrote a book on the architecture of a rather obscure sultanate called the Sultanate of Ahmednagar, obscure because it was not much written about. And that has an absolutely extraordinary manuscript in which there are 12 paintings, 6 of war and 6 of peacetime. And the paintings of peacetime, almost all of them show the queen, which is very unusual in an Islamic manuscript. And when you look at the painting, you'll realize, I mean, in this, it's a long story as to why she's been erased and blotted out. But the king was sitting with his queen on the takht, on the throne platform in a garden. Compositionally, the painting borrows completely from Persian paintings that you have in Herat and Shiraz at this time. So you look at how it's composed with a tree on the left, with a pavilion, then some kind of seating area. But everything else in there, all the details are completely local and Indic. And as Naman said, when ideas travel, we don't just borrow them and apply them, we actually make them our own by inserting elements that really are very local. And so this is the kind of behavior people indulge in. It's not some kind of prescribed normative behavior that comes from a manual of painting, but people actually paint in ways that they know, and they will take on things that are either fashionable, powerful, or things that they like at times. And so if you look at the king and the queen, in many ways, they're extremely comparable to a very fashionable sculpture typology that was prevalent from the 8th to the 13th century in the Deccan, this Uma Maheshwar. And if anybody's read Daud Ali's courtly culture, you'll notice that the king, Hussain Nizam Shah, is sitting with his foot upturned. He's showing you the sole of his foot, which would be considered extremely insulting in an Islamic context. But this is very much a part of the measured and calculated casualness that Indian sculptures depict kings in. And so the king sitting with his wife, sitting with his foot upturned. If you notice below his feet, there are footstools. All the women are dressed in saris. You have attendants who have fan cloths, something that Shauri bearers have traditionally held. All this makes the painting really local. But again, the aspiration is to copy something from Iran, but localize it heavily. Again, you find extraordinary things in the middle of nowhere. These wind catchers in Iran, which are called badgirs, used in very hot climates. You have them in a couple of places in Ahmednagar, built completely out of stone. The ones in Iran are built completely out of brick. But the technology is exactly the same, where you build subterranean chambers and you let wind flow in and let it cool those chambers, and it's then shunted out. And again, there are all kinds of things like this which you will find in the countryside, even around Hyderabad. But this never finds its way into any kind of mainstream history. And this tells you a very different story, not of a minister like Mahmud Gawan who comes from Iran to Bidar, but it tells you the story of workmen who've come, who have these technologies. Sometimes you have all kinds of subaltern stories too, because when you start looking at the ways in which the masonry is constructed, there are fingerprints all over the masonry. You can see certain crafts traditions, which means a substantial body of craftsmen has to have migrated, or at least master masons have come in and trained local artisans. And that's a very different telling and narrative from what a general political history might give you. There is a mosque type called the Nine-Bay Mosque, which emerges very early in bulk in the 8th century. And within 2 centuries, it's rife across the Islamic world. You find it in Tunisia, you find it in Toledo in Spain, you find it everywhere. And what's absolutely stunning is that 1,000 years later, the Marathas will build a temple in their capital at Pune, and they will use the same 9-bay plan with almost no modification. And again, what does this tell you? What kind of counter-narrative is this to a standard telling of history in which all we know, and increasingly, I mean, these fights are being polarized as, fights between binary factions. It's a very complicated society, and the material culture certainly suggests something very different in terms of a story. On the right-hand side, you have a temple at Nasik called the Naroshankar Temple, built in the 18th century again. And that temple essentially is a revival-style temple. So they've brought in artisans from North India to build this Shekhari temple. But around it, the compound wall is exactly that of a Mughal garden. And so what kind of message is being sent out? What kind of proclamation is being made? Is this a proclamation of the Marathas that they've now taken over Delhi and they've brought back a piece of Delhi with them, which they are going to project to everyone else? I mean, in a pre-industrial age, the only way in which you carried out your propaganda was architecture, coinage, and a few other performative modes. And architecture was long-lasting and certainly conveyed something. And this kind of behavior in which you emulate those whom you've conquered, those whom you've really defeated, is called triumphalism. And we see examples of this where you claim somebody else by incorporating their behavior and also the kinds of things that they build. And so it's never this belongs to this and that belongs to that. There is always a dynamic interplay in the visual language that both sides use, and it's done very playfully. And so I wrote a bunch of articles about what happens when things that are supposed to not be together actually do come together. Like you see tabuts in Muharram processions across the Deccan. From the 18th century onwards, the form that you see of these tabuts is very different from the tabuts you see in North India. It's very different from tabuts in Patna. You'll find this in Indore, you'll find this in Gujarat, and you'll find this in Maharashtra. And if you look at them and compare them to Maratha temples which are being built in the 18th and 19th century, there is absolutely no denial that the same form means some kind of power. So divinity, if it has to be invoked, is invoked in this architectural form, is the popular understanding. There's no theological basis for this, there's no scriptural basis. These temples are about as removed from classical temples as you can imagine, but the tabuts also don't look like what they're supposed to represent, the tomb of Hussein at Karbala or the Tazia, which is the coffin. It doesn't stop in this kind of pre-industrial age, but something I wrote later was on market halls in colonial India, where just like a number of modernizing institutions that were mentioned earlier by Aparajit, the princely states and the British government sought to modernize. They wanted to project themselves as agents of modernization. And this they did through a series of monumental buildings that were all supposed to represent progressive, modern systems and ideals. And so you have museums and post offices, hospitals. This is all from Hyderabad, built all in the early 20th century in an architectural style which has been called the CIB style, City Improvement Board style, very consciously crafted as a way of amalgamating Hyderabad's history and projecting it into a modern future. And of course, a market hall also gets built, the Moazzam Jahi Market, at the same time in this same style. And so here, architecture clearly is being used to project a message to the public, to the people. This is propaganda of the state. This is, insidious messaging. The messaging is visual. You'll never find it written down anywhere. This is history that you don't recover from texts. They never tell you that this is the message we are trying to project, but you can read it on here. And in this day and age, when increasingly almost all the messaging that we receive from popular media is coming in the form of visuals, I think it's incredibly important that we learn to read what visual messages look like and how you get shaped by them at all times. Oh, sorry. And there are also convergences of form. In fact, I had something about this. Kamadhenu and the popular poster of the Burak. Both of them have completely different ontological bases, but eventually under a single cultural milieu, in a single ecumeny, they've managed to converge into looking more or less similar, though there is absolutely no need for them to. Again, both these forms are not prescribed. This is what people do. And sometimes what people in power do also is about making certain kinds of impressions. So you look at Falaknuma Palace, which is built in a completely European style, and a century before that, well, half a century, you have the Prince Regent building the Royal Pavilion at Brighton, which he believes is in a completely Indian style. So what kind of message, again, are people in power trying to convey? What kind of world do people who are not in power try to really be a part of? That's a mosque in Bombay, which is built with completely imported material from Iran. Again, what does the patron wish to convey? Is it pure nostalgia? Given the amount of real resources, money, time, and otherwise, this is not a frivolous exercise. So there has to be serious messaging. And I think we see a lot of this in these examples. On top, you look at fortification. Again, there is a lot that the building itself will tell you. If you can see, the crenellations have changed over time. There are older ones, there are newer ones. And these are all responses to gunpowder technology. As gunpowder changes, guns change, the crenellations keep changing. Again, you are not going to find this written down in any text, partly because as opposed to Europe, we don't have a tradition of recording everything in writing. Part of it has to do with a certain kind of habit we have in South Asia. People who write usually do not do things, and people who do things usually do not write. And therefore, art history becomes all the more important for South Asia, where a completely different narrative can be unfolded. And last, I'll just talk about the temple at Brihadeshwara, which has one of the largest Marathi inscriptions anywhere in the world, an inscription written in 1804 when the medium is completely antiquated. Nobody is reading it. Furthermore, they ensure that nobody can read it by first writing it in Devanagari, which nobody around there reads, and then writing it in Marathi, which very few people understand, and then making sure it's badly scrawled across walls and rambling surfaces. And the whole purpose of this inscription is not to be read. So why is it put there, again at expense? Is it trying to be like the Cholas, whose mantle the Bhonsles at Tanjavur want to claim? There is a much bigger context to it, a much bigger story, where Colin Mackenzie is collecting authentic information about peninsular India. And Sir Phorji II has come to power through a court struggle patronized by the British. He is put on throne, but he loses all his real powers. His powers are limited to temples and a few charitable institutions. And so almost as an act of defiance, he once kicks out the great trigonometric survey from the temple at Tanjavur, and then eventually has a big composition made by one of his secretaries, Baburao Chitnis, and presented to Colin Mackenzie. And almost as if to reinforce in the eyes of Mackenzie that this is not a document we've just composed, he also has it carved in the temple. So again, in this case, the medium is the message. And you'll see a lot of this where materials, again, give a different story. You have stories that straddle regions, forms from Spain to India in terms of architecture can be the same. You have continuities through time. The same manuscript that I mentioned also has a painting of a Dohada, a lady who's touching a tree that bursts into bloom, something that you see at Sanchi. Again, in a Buddhist site, and then a Muslim manuscript in the 16th century reproduces it with the queen touching the tree to make it bloom. And so these are not simple stories, and I don't think textual histories, at least in South Asia, certainly are adequate to talk about the past in general. So with that, I'll stop here. And, oops, sorry. We don't need this. So, thank you all for being patient listeners. And I was just going to start off with a couple of questions between us. Let me check what the time is. It's 5:10, so we don't have a lot of time. But there are two things that you always see when you study material culture as opposed to textual culture. Textual cultures love to keep things contained within regions and geographies, whereas material culture seems to be a lot more trans-regional, just like the Bodhisattva that was talked about, also this goddess Hariti. The idea is that material forms can be multivalent, so they can really appeal to multiple audiences at the same time. And these multiple audiences are very often across large geographical distances. So would you have something to talk about that in terms of examples?
So, yeah, certainly. And I mean, I completely agree with you, Pushkar, about the role of material and visual cultures in history writing. I think we can nuance it further, like you saw in the Hariti image that Naman was, what a kind of a close zooming in into the visual detail can bring out. And the visual material, since I teach art history in a history department, I've mulled over the relationship between both art and history and art history and history for now many, many years. I find that even the nature of relationship is not kind of, there's a lot of nuance to it. So there's, on occasion, like the Buddhagupta stele, you need to look at image and text together. At times, you look at what the text doesn't say, or, at other, like Pushkar was showing, or Naman was showing in a couple of his slides. Then there are, how have visualities completely altered something that has gone from one region to another, and then through the visual trying to understand how a religious symbol like Meru becomes a historical propaganda. So you have many different levels at which art and history engage with each other. And the deeper you go into the subject, the more, certainly ignoring the visual is a huge loss to the discipline, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. We have suffered on account of looking at only prioritizing certain types of history, and I think there is a big shift now in the history of psychology, and even doing the history of religion finally is something that is catching on in South Asia. It used to always be a major subject all over the world, but history of religion was also sort of not really done within South Asia, which was a real problem. I feel that even if you do comparative literature properly, you have to use the tools of history to be able to do comparative lit in a really thorough way. And it's just that even comparative lit is not really, has sort of been going out of favor as a domain and as a field of the humanities. And so it's not just about being able to do architectural studies and to be able to do painting studies that is been facing this. So whenever we start dialoguing with scholars who are similarly occupied with looking at comparative studies on music or architecture or literature or poetry, you suddenly find that there is an entire method and way of thinking about a particular period in terms of its contextualization. And I think in terms of the publishing of these things, we've had enormous success because of the Murthy Classical Library and the Clay Sanskrit Library in the past decade or so, or 2 decades now since the Clay Sanskrit Library came, which has been enormously helpful because one has got accessible, contextual, literary material with which to look at the art and with which to look at the material culture that we all focus on, without making that material culture merely illustrative of history, but actually a contextualized communication through a language of aesthetics, which is also not just being made up. We're not just concocting that language of aesthetic communication.
Yeah, so there's a method.
There's a method.
There's a method to reading an image,
Yeah.
just like there's a method to reading a text, and you know, the language of gesture, posture, also visual literacy. So how do you sort of understand regional specificity vis-a-vis something that is happening somewhere else? That is more important before you come to transculturalism, let's say. But the other thing that I thought I could highlight, Pushkar and Naman, is this whole idea of art history being a soft discipline, or it's actually there's a lot of art history out on the field. It's not just in the comfortable spaces of museums and air-conditioned libraries. We move out on the field. Here's my trophy from my recent trek to Naneghat to understand how ancient traders trekked up that pass.
Yeah, I
and
know.
so, I mean, I'd really like to
Yeah, we've all got
to
broken
flag
enough.
like to flag that art history is in no way a soft discipline, or and
Well, no, I mean,
it's
it's become the
yeah.
field for political contestation in the highest degree. And as Pushkar was saying, that propaganda has invariably utilized the visual as its principal means of communication.
And since the creations, I mean, the objects of study of art history are created at all levels, one really has to make these distinctions. When they are expressly political, they are made with a certain motivation, whereas there are more organic processes in which communities will imbibe visual cultures from all around and synthesize them. So what you adopt, whether knowingly or unknowingly, is something that's very important to discern. Now, art history as a discipline has a lot of theoretical writing on it, and a tradition of theoretical writing for 150 years now, unless you go back to Winckelmann, but at least with Riegel and so on. And again, there is a rigor, there is a method, and art historians also range a lot in terms of what they do, from people who look at very narrow periods of time dealing with a single material, to people who are more generalists, to people who are almost archaeologists but do, let's call it, non-destructive archaeology by looking at things without necessarily excavating or digging them up. But there are methods for all these shades, and it's important to realize that it's different from art connoisseurship, art appreciation, art criticism, or art collecting, which may or may not always agree with art history.
Yeah, absolutely. And if I could, with your permission, go back to the first slide of the afternoon. I deliberately quoted Rabindranath Tagore there. I didn't have the time to explain it, where he, while being very much part of a greater India society, had acute sympathies for the agency of Southeast Asia. I think we are treading, as of now, the milieu that we live in now. The danger of placing India once again at the center of Jambudweep or top Mount Meru, where India is all gold, and everything seems to have come out of India. I think cross-cultural histories of any kind, including cross-cultural histories of art, need to recognize and mutually respect the cultures in contact. So I think we are poised now. We are not freeing ourselves of the yoke of British colonialism, and we need to have faith and confidence in what India has to offer the world. Not try and culturally once again colonize in our discourse Asian countries.
Yes, questions? Everybody's stunned into silence or fallen asleep. Right here.
Please indulge me because I'm not trained in the humanities. So I see a lot of talk about the art, I'm wondering whether the artists are over-socialized to the point that they become victims of existing or past historical iconography. And when does that change happen, right? When does the artist be more than simply an expression of propaganda, political ideology,
Thank you very much.
religiosity?
That's a
Thanks.
very important question. One of the big problems with the writing Indian art history has been that we have anonymized our ancient artists and we haven't followed the biographical mode adequately to be able to resuscitate the careers of specific artists in order to be able to say what their individual agency might have been in making and doing what they did. And this is not a problem that is peculiar to pre-modern art of India. It is a problem that is endemic all over the world. In fact, the more one looks carefully at medieval Indian sculpture, it is becoming possible to at least identify a number of the guilds that were operating and that were vying with each other for the best commissions. And indeed, many a monarch in times past would have received petitions from competing guilds. So I don't think ancient workers at these monastic sites or temples were simply inheritors of ancient iconographic systems that they were slavishly executing for some transcendental sadhana of theirs, but they were indeed actually made of the same sort of stuff of competitiveness, I'm sure, that modern artists exhibit. So I think alongside, we have to be able to look at the extraordinary work that was done by B.N. Goswami at really looking at the family as the basis of style in endogamous societies where you have a custom which we call the gharana as a method of pedagogy, where a certain Guru Shishya Parampara gets established not necessarily in a bloodline, but at least in a certain coterie of artists that become your sort of adoptive legatees of your pedagogical instruction. And then they continue with a certain method of pedagogy that carries on. Each of these systems of artistic training was obviously extremely rich. And as we are learning more and more about the oeuvre of these individual artists and these schools or gharanas, one begins to realize how much knowledge they had and how they passed it on, and what the interventions could have been in each historical moment by each guild or by each group of artists.
So also more recently, this whole idea of the agency of the artist, art historians have managed to push it to the pre-medieval, early medieval, 6th century, 7th century. I recently wrote a long essay on the agency of the artist. And there are some beautiful messages left by artists of ancient India, where one of them says that Kaschit Jambu Dvipantare Narasobba na Sama Vidwan na Bhuto na Bhavishyati. He is a Vastu Vidya Vidwan. He is an architect par excellence. This is 7th century. And he says that in the entire Jambu Dweep, never has such a supremely accomplished architect ever been born or will ever be born. And then they compare themselves to standards in text, Natya Shastra. So this performer performs this particular movement better than any other performer. There's a sense of competition. There's a sense of recognition that changes our perception of their anonymity completely.
And like anything that has a significant investment in it, they can't completely disregard what their patron has to say. But they do leave their, how shall we say, vestiges of their agency in small marginalia and corners where you'll very often see slightly offbeat or naughty things where you least expect them.
Yes, yes. Yeah. So that's a theme for another panel.
But any other questions? Yeah, right there.
Hi, good afternoon. It was a wonderfully insightful session. Thank you so much. I was just wondering, there was a lot of interrelatedness and a lot of connections between different religions, different regions, different communities in the art that you guys represented. I was wondering if this is something that we could introduce in schools as well, like art history as a subject, because the texts that I had,
About time.
I think visual learning will benefit a lot of students. Everybody does not learn the same way. And we force everybody to learn mathematics, even people who went on to become big statesmen were failing in mathematics. We learned by the morning session. I think visual learning can really change the, kind of engagement that a lot of students will have.
I think we've seen this where images were so hard to come by 50, 60 years ago that people would cut out pictures from magazines and keep them. And now we absolutely have no value for images because you can summon them at any point. So increasingly we float in a world of images and we have to learn, we have to be aware of how they shape us.
I think that's become, if there was ever a moment when the study of visual culture would become an intrinsic part of history or psychology or any of the other disciplines in social sciences, it is now, when we are bombarded by images at a pace and in a manner that we've never been, I think, as a civilization, frankly.
My question has to do with the fact that artists in general tend to have a sense of satire, humor and so on in their element, whether it is Hieronymus Bosch or R.K. Lakshman or whatever. We tend to look at the kind of art you presented with a very serious, most of it does not
Thank
seem
you,
to
yes.
have
Yes.
the element of humor. How
Yes.
does that happen?
I think that's largely because of the unfortunate circumstances of the kind of things that we've been looking at. We've been looking at stone monuments, which are religious monuments, and they are filled with religious imagery of a particular kind. So it tends to have a larger number of images of gods. But first caveat is that I think there was a massive amount of painting in ancient India. And the more you study sculpture, you realize what an extraordinary tradition of painting has been lost. It becomes manifest. And that is a medium through which you can communicate a lot more humor and satire because it's got a lot of immediacy. But when it comes to something like stone and you're going to spend 6 months sculpting something monumental that is meant to last the centuries, by its very nature of the medium, it ends up taking on a certain seriousness. That's one thing. That said, there is still a lot of humor within the tradition once one knows how to read it. But I think to simply say that where is the caricature? I think the caricature was there. One finds a little bit of it in Sanchi, one finds a little bit of it in Ajanta, in the paintings, one finds a little bit of it. But there is caricature and satire and humor. And I think the greatest example of it, of course, is the Mahabalipuram, the cat who's doing yoga in front of the lifting up its arms. I think
Yeah,
those
wherever you have narrative elaboration, there's a lot of the comic element and the element of satire. The Great Penance Relief at Mahabalipuram is full of satire. And what about those lovely ganas on the plinths? You know, there's such a lot of the element of, a kind of almost as though
The most
relieving
ridiculous-
you of the seriousness of what is happening in the world of
I
the
don't know
gods.
if anyone has ever been to Badami.
The ganas are amazing. Those
ganas-
dwarf creatures.
The Ganas of
they are,
Badami, including one who is bending down and parting his bottom for everyone to see what he is revealing. And it is at the base of a shrine dedicated to a deity, and you would see these ridiculously caricatural characters who are doing all kinds of naughty things.
And there's also a lot of humor in language and punning, where, for example, at Mahabalipuram, there is an apsidal temple, and that apsidal
Yes,
form is
yes.
known as the Gajaprichar, the rear of an elephant. And immediately next to it, they've placed an elephant standing backwards.
So
And
there's a-
you have to know the literary term, you have to know the...
It's also very much connected with poetics and poetry. So, you know, the Drishya or Kavya, it's going together. And so the poetics have figures of speech or alankaras that evoke hasya and satire, and that finds its presence in the visual.
Exactly. I mean, that's why I've
also.
been going on about comparative literature and comparative poetry. Sorry.
I just have a comment. When you were talking of paintings, you know, and it is very difficult. We do not have the names of these painters. But when you come to Deccan, especially, you know, 16th, 17th century, we have a lot of painting done by the local artisans. They are taking European themes. You know, you have Mother Mary, Jesus Christ, but they are all dressed like Muslims. So it almost becomes like a caricature, but maybe it is the artists are more comfortable. You also have a painting of the Holy Family, where the whole family is dressed up, you know, with these long coats, and they look like Muslim. So they have taken European themes, but converted them into what they are familiar with or they are comfortable with.
Well, as you do have many images of the Virgin Mary in a sari and even with a bindi and so on, and as you have images of each of these, so this intercultural assimilation is very much part of what we look at and study. Yeah.
Namanji, this is only what we call a supplementary information. What we have said that caricatures, sculptures are very, in large number we find at Badami. Similarly, the same is the case with Alampur group of temples. You come look at each and every, what you call that niche. At the bottom register, you find beautiful caricatures as if they are heckling at us.
Yes.
So many, not one. As you said, that one actually touching the
Yes, yes.
many number of things is there, but just mentioned by P.R. Ramchandra Rao, etc.
Right.
A specific study was not at all taken on this aspect. Kindly guide your students to take up only caricature sculpture in early medieval
I have a
India.
student who is submitting her PhD thesis on exactly this topic within the next 3 months, in fact.
Yeah.
It's a great topic. That's why it's a, yeah.
Yeah.
Do you want to add something?
No, I'm done.
Thank you so much. That's a wonderful note actually to end on, the sense of humor in the world of art. Thank you so much for taking us through centuries, interpretations of art in a variety of forms. Truly thrilling. I was just, standing there looking at these images here, and I was thinking, 1,000 years later, how would people interpret these images, And I think Naman and Parul would look pretty much similar, but I don't think, a person 1,000 years later is going to get Pushkar, the interpretation of Pushkar quite wrong, I suspect, after 1,000 years on that image. Slide off a bit? Okay. Yeah, or they might interpret it as a sense of humor, after 1,000 years on this sense. Thank you so much. May I invite Professor Rakesh Basant to present mementos to our speakers. May I also remind the audience that we do have a bookstall and a wonderful exhibition about 50 meters from here. And the speakers are going to be with us. Their books are there. You can get a signed copy. And you can also meet them tomorrow. That concludes our second session. For